Hey everyone, and welcome back to this introduction to India and South Asia. I'm Benjamin Siegel, and I'm thrilled to have you back with me here today. Today we're going to cover what to me is one of the strangest and most remarkable things that has ever happened in human history. In the course of just around 150 years, a big company was established and it took control of one of the richest, most powerful places on planet Earth. Nothing like this had ever happened before. There had been some small examples before. A small Dutch company had established a little governed space in the island of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. But what happened with the East India Company was truly unprecedented in scale and scope. In order to tell our story today, we're going to have to move away from India and go to London, the year that the English East India Company was founded. This was one of several European trading ventures that was launched with the goal of tapping the riches of the East. This company is founded as a joint stock enterprise, and it's one of the first in the world. The joint stock company was one of the great innovations of its day. Individuals in Europe couldn't hope to trade so far away from the continent. The risks were just too big, especially in the context of England, where the English crown wouldn't commit itself or its resources to something with so many risks. Joint stock organizations meant that merchants were able to take on big risks in their trade, and they were able to raise funds from a large group of people. This meant that a joint stock company had a strong and effective organization, and this would become very important by the time that the company arrived in India, where there were prodigious and formidable merchant families. The company was founded with a big organization. There was a 24-member court of directors, they had a central archive, they had staff who had been recruited for special skills. The best way to think about this organization is the same way that you would think about a well-funded startup today. Now, the company did have the approval of the Crown. It got a monopoly over Britain's Asian trade, meaning that it could trade anywhere it wanted without competition from others. And it was also given the right to arm its vessels so that it could fend off competitors from elsewhere in Europe. Company boats began arriving in Asia at the beginning of the 17th century. And what were they drawn to? It was the spice trade. They didn't go to India at first, though. They showed up in a place that they called the East Indies, a place we'd now think of as Indonesia and Malaysia. But when they got there, they quickly found that another company had gotten there first, the Dutch East India Company, that had already gotten their trading underway. The Dutch East India Company was much better financed, it was better organized, and it was more rooted in local context. So the British East India Company arrived in the East Indies, but then they quickly shifted their plans and they decided to move their operations to India. This was a problem, though, since India actually didn't have a lot of the spices that Europeans were looking for at the time. India had things like Malabar pepper, and the company started bringing back a lot of pepper to England. But to make matters worse, Britain didn't really have anything that Indians were actually interested in buying. In one of the great blunders of history, they had mostly brought woolen goods to trade, and wool doesn't do you a lot of good in the Indian subcontinent. So the company at the very beginning had to export gold bullion in order to even pay for their purchases. This was a really bad idea. It went contrary to all the big principles of mercantilism, which was the reigning commercial ideology of the day. The Dutch in the East Indies found themselves to be pretty competitive on the local scene there. But the British arrived in India when the Mughal Empire was really at its height, so there was no thought of conquest by arms. So instead, they were petitioners really begging for access to the market. The good thing was that the Mughals indulged the Britons at first. They were pretty happy to avoid the dominance of the Portuguese and later of the Dutch. And Indian merchants were happy too because now there were some new opportunities for profitable trade overseas. For the East India Company, things began to improve slowly over the course of the 17th century. There was a secure and pretty steadily profitable trade, and in place of the lucrative but limited trade in spices, the English began developing new markets in Europe for lots of new Indian products. The first of these was indigo, which is a plant that you can use to make a very fashionable blue dye, and the second was saltpeter, which is used to help make gunpowder. But the most important object of trade between India and Europe were textiles, and handloom textiles in particular. Back in England, after around 1660, this was a time of great growth of the consumer economy. There was a big booming demand in British households for Indian fabrics, things like chintz, calico, and muslin, which are all, by the way, Indian words. The modern consumer in Britain was crazy for what were seen as luxury goods of the tropics, really high-quality hand-loomed goods. To give you a sense of numbers, the companies Imports from India to Europe in 1670 were around 36,000 pounds. But over the next 30 years, they tripled in value, and then they doubled again. So by 1740, they would reach 2 million pounds. This was major trade. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. In 1617, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who we talked about last time, gave a grant to Sir Thomas Roe, who was working as the English ambassador to the Mughal court. Under the terms of this grant, the English would be allowed to establish what they called factories in Mughal ports, and the most important of these ports was in the town of Surat in Gujarat. When we talk about factories, these aren't factories the way we use the word today, like a site for manufacturing. Instead, these were mostly warehouses where goods would be collected by local resident British agents, and then they were loaded onto the ship and sent back to Europe. As with any modern port, there was customs revenue being taken in, so a lot of European money was streaming into India, and there were a number of new jobs created at this time. The weaving industry in India was booming. But the biggest beneficiaries of the British trade in India were local merchant entrepreneurs. These were men who were creditors or bankers or petty merchants who gave advances to weavers and then supplied local commodities to the European companies. In short, middlemen made a lot of good business during this early period of the British East India Company. But as we discussed last time, Mughal power was beginning to fade by the beginning of the 18th century. And the company at the same time was discovering that their factories were vulnerable. The Emperor Shivaji of the Marathas raided the big factory in Surat 2 times, and so the British East India Company turned to a new policy at the beginning of the century of armed defense. This caused an early confrontation, and the Mughal authorities were able to put down their first efforts. But by 1700, the company had established secured forts in 3 Indian cities, in Madras, in Bombay, and Calcutta, and they expected in their private correspondence that their authority was going to spread and become more dominant in the Indian center. At the beginning, these were mostly just small strongholds in coastal India, secured by powerful fortifications. We're talking about places like Fort St. George in Madras. But over time, they began to grow. And these became very attractive sites for Indian merchants who started to flock to the British factories. The English were able to reassure Indians that, unlike the Jesuits, they had no real interest in converting them to Christianity. Throughout the 1700s, missionaries were more or less barred from the English settlements in India. But the company was able to expand its power. By 1661, it secured the island of Bombay for its own possession. How did they do that? Well, basically the same way that other alliances were working in Europe at this time. In this case, it was part of the dowry for a Portuguese princess who married King Charles II. Bombay was a mid-sized but growing Indian port city at this time, and so Britain moved their west coast operations from Surat in Gujarat to Bombay further down the coast. At the same time, Parsi merchants starting to arrive at Bombay, seeing it as an important settlement where there was a lot of trade to be done. While Bombay was becoming the site of British power in the west, Calcutta was becoming more and more important a city in the east. Calcutta had a population of around 120,000 in 1750, it had around 200,000 by 1780, and around 350,000 by 1820. This is a very fast-growing city by 18th and 19th century standards. If we went to Calcutta around 1750 or so, it was really just a conglomeration of landing stages on the river, places where boats anchored, fishing and weaving villages, a number of Hindu holy sites like Kaligat. There were communities of weavers and small-scale merchants who could act as agents or purchasers, commissaries for company ships. Up until around 1780 or so, Calcutta and Madras didn't really look like colonial cities. They were basically stretches of waterside markets and villages. They looked more or less like trading villages all up and down the Indian coast. In Bombay and Madras and Calcutta, the British East India Company officials who came to India lived mostly inside the forts. They would deal with Indian brokers and merchants outside, and merchants were the intermediaries who procured textiles from weavers in the countryside by giving advances. Just to back up for a second, it's important to remember that these cities weren't established with the idea of colonial conquest. There were never more than a few hundred British personnel who were posted at each one of these sites, a lot of whom had been picked up on the streets of London and been promised an adventure overseas. But the India trade at this point was part of a large worldwide trading arena. Commodities were moving all around the world in this time. There was Guinea cloth, which was moving from India to West Africa. That was used to purchase slaves, who in turn went to Caribbean plantations in North America. In Southeast Asia, Indian textiles were used to finance the spice trade. The English always had to contend with other powerful rival companies who were establishing forts along the coast of India at the same time. By the 1680s, in addition to the Dutch, there were also the Danes looking for money in India. The French had been operating for quite a while out of their capital of Pondicherry, which was a South Indian enclave that they would hold on to as late as 1950. But again, the Mughal Empire was weakening. Aurangzeb had died, and the India trade was growing more and more important to Britain. So for the European companies working there, it became more and more important to secure political control and to best the other European powers operating on the Indian subcontinent. In 1717, the British secured from one of the lesser Mughal emperors the right to export their goods from Bengal duty-free. But it was really the French in this period who were good at scheming. Now, you don't need to know this, but this was the same time that in Europe there was the War of Austrian Succession taking place. This was a war that kicked off 70 years of conflict between Britain and France. But increasingly, this war wasn't taking place in Europe, but it was being played out elsewhere on the globe, in North America and in Asia. In India, the French Governor-General was a man named François Dupuy, and he saw that in India there were a number of conflicts taking place where two princes were vying for succession to the throne. Think back to Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh. For the first time, European-style militaries were functioning at large scale in India. It became clear that a few hundred French or British soldiers who worked in a square European-style formation were able to hold off thousands of Mughal cavalrymen working on horses. So a contingent of European troops became more and more valuable to an Indian ruler. There was something in this for Indian sovereigns too. So Dupuy came up with a strategy. He would offer the more powerful prince the support of French troops, and once they had their client prince in power, he would give the French favorable commercial terms, and that of course came at the expense of the British. Dupuy was even more clever than this. He also started moving against the British directly. In 1746, he briefly seized control of the British fort in Madras. Indian princes were impressed by Dupuy and what they saw as European audacity. But the British weren't going to sit back and let the French take control of things for too long. They started fighting back. In 1749, they regained control of Madras under the same treaty that ended the War of Austrian Succession. And they set out to turn the tables by besting the French at their own game. They put their client on the throne of Arcot, which was one of the most important sites that the French had managed to capture. And after this big defeat, Dupuy was recalled to France in disgrace. Basically, Dupuy was clever, and he was savvy, and he understood that there was a precarious political order in India, that moment of decentralized power that we were talking about before. He saw really well how to manipulate it to his own advantage. But the French didn't have the resources to contain their rivals. Maybe more importantly, the French never developed the close ties with Indian merchants and intermediaries that the British did. As a result, the French-India trade, which on average was about half of the English companies in value, it had sunk by the middle of the century to about a quarter of their rivals. But for Britain, the company had emerged over the course of the century as a major player in domestic politics. At home in port cities in England, people saw trade coming in, new commodities streaming into the ports. In 1740, Britain sung for the first time the song Rule Britannia, and it was clear that the growth of the India trade had become more and more important in the creation of the British economy, but also the rise of a new sense of British identity. Let's turn our attention to the province of Bengal in India's east. Before the arrival of the British, Bengal had been something of a provincial place. It wasn't unimportant, but it wasn't necessarily the center of economic or political action in India. But all that was about to change. There were a lot of good natural resources there. It was a rich deltaic province, and it was an outlet for all the trade that was taking place in the Ganges Valley. By 1750, it accounted for 3/4 of the company's procurement of Indian goods. Over the course of the 18th century, the English began to envision India as a place of unbelievable wealth, inexhaustible riches. And in British art at the time, like this painting called The East Offering Its Riches, they began to envision that they had a right to trade and to take this wealth. But Bengal's politics were also really volatile in this same period. Different princes or nawabs were vying for control. There were big banking interests vying for power, and the zamindars, the landowners, were also growing nervous. The British began to get cocky. They started to abuse the privileges of free trade that they had gained. By the middle of the century, they were often selling off their free trade passes to their favorite Indian merchants. They were extending their privileges and working their way into the internal trade in India, trading in commodities like grain. So in 1756, as the French and the English were beginning to up their fighting, the British began extending the fortifications in Calcutta. The Nawab of Bengal in this time was named Suraj-ud-Dowla. As he came onto the throne, he was eager to assert his authority, and he saw the British fortifications as inexcusable provocations. So in June 1756, he took his troops and he marched to Calcutta. He defeated the whole garrison there, and he imprisoned all the British officials who weren't able to run away in time. He locked 40 of them in a small airless room, and out of neglect, they died that same evening of suffocation. Suraj-ud-Dowla hadn't ordered this, but it was negligence on the part of his officers, and it came to be known among Britons as the Black Hole of Calcutta. For years and years, Britons would talk about the Black Hole of Calcutta as proof of Indian cruelty and barbarism. The British had to avenge this humiliation, and so they turned to a general, Sir Robert Clive, who had distinguished himself during a number of French and English battles in southern India. So an expedition came up from Madras, and Clive was able to retake Calcutta in February of 1757, and he was able to secure restoration of the company's trading privileges. But the British were angry and upset, and they weren't content with this victory. Clive looked around him for Indians who could serve as important intermediaries and allies, and he turned, perhaps obviously, to merchant bankers operating in Bengal at the same time. In particular, he looked to Jagat Seth, who was the head of a powerful banking family at odds with the Nawab of Bengal because of financial conflicts between them. Jagat Seth joined forces with another banker named Omi Chand, who had also grown very powerful in the same period. These two banking families had control of the Bengal mint, and so they were responsible for sending along the periodic payments that were still due to the Mughal emperor. These were very powerful financial actors, so maybe it wasn't that surprising that the British turned to them for help. So together, Robert Clive and these bankers hoped to overturn the Nawab, Suraj-ud-Dowla. They joined in a conspiracy, and they identified a disaffected general named Mir Jafar, who they thought could help him. Mir Jafar promised that in return for placing him on the throne, he would give the British lavish payments. So there was a major conspiracy underfoot, and on June 23, 1757, the Battle of Plassey took place. In a military sense, this battle was a farce. Mir Jafar's troops just stood there looking on while Clive completely routed Suraj-ud-Dowla's remaining forces. It was a huge turning point in the history of the British in India. Right after the Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar was named Nawab. He became Prince of Bengal. But he was seen, and he essentially was a puppet who was maintained in power only by Robert Clive and the officers of the British East India Company. This was an incredibly lucrative deal for the British. The British East India Company received 28 million rupees, which is equivalent to around 3 million pounds sterling. It was an insane fortune. Half of this went to private individuals in the company, including Robert Clive himself. And in addition, the company was given the revenue collecting rights over a number of districts in Bengal, and they were allowed unimpeded trading access to the countryside. I've never thought that this was going to be a conquest, and neither did the company directors back in Britain. But the company's employees in India were determined to make big fortunes for themselves, and so they fended off any efforts to rein them in. They lived extravagantly in India, and Indians and Britons alike started to refer to company officials as nabobs, which was a joking play on Nawab or prince. The company was hungry for more, and they sought more funds to underwrite their trading operations. After 1757, the company stopped shipping bullion from Europe to Bengal. Instead, they started collecting internal tax revenues, which they used to purchase goods in India and then ship them overseas to England. Basically, they were drawing money away from Indian merchants in the Indian countryside and sending it back to Britain. There was a sense among company officials that there really was no end to Bengal's riches. But increasingly, these riches came from the trade in valuable commodities that used to be reserved for princes themselves. These were prestige goods, and they were also symbolic of the Nawab's authority. Commodities like salt, betel nut, tobacco, salt. In 1760, Mir Jafar was replaced by Mir Qasim. But Mir Qasim was upset by what he thought was the British plunder of Bengal. And so he began to try to retrieve his authority over the northern part of Bengal and the province of Bihar right next to it. This provoked a new confrontation. The British were out for blood. They wanted wealth and they wanted power, and they didn't want any constraints on their ability to actualize it. By 1764, a confrontation was inevitable and the battle lines had been drawn. On the one side, there was the Prince of Bengal, Mir Qasim, who was working alongside the Prince of Awadh and also the Mughal Emperor, even with his diminished authority. On the other side was the East India Company. And so on October 23, 1764, there was a major battle at the city of Buxar. This wasn't a fake battle like the one which had taken place in Plassey, but the British emerged successful and they became the masters of Eastern India. At this point, it was impossible to keep up the charade that the British were just in India as traders. Now they were there as political authorities. In 1765, they signed a treaty with the Mughal Emperor, and the company secured the Divani, or the right to collect revenue, in the provinces of Bengal and Bihar and Orissa. Legally, this made the company the emperor's deputy, so it served as a combination of really the revenue minister or the secretary of state, though the administration of justice and law was still given over to the Nawab. Bengal was still, in this point, technically a Mughal province, but it was essentially completely under control of the East India Company. The emperor back in Delhi had no independent authority, and the Nawab or prince was just a figurehead. The British East India Company was divided in this period. They weren't sure whether they were ready to abandon the certainties of profitable trade for the much more uncertain advantages of rule. Robert Clive at first is happy to leave the collection of revenue to the Nawab's officials, but pretty quickly he decides that this isn't going to do it all. The company doesn't really trust any of these local officials, and certainly not any local military authority. And so in 1772, the British decide that they're going to stand forth as Divan, and they're going to take on all of this work directly by themselves. There were already major ominous signs that this was going to have big consequences for Indians. Between 1769 and 1770, there was a major famine that took place in Bengal. Nearly a quarter of the population of the province died. The British weren't directly responsible for the famine, but they certainly had disrupted the trade, and they bore a great responsibility. In any case, this wasn't a very good omen for what was going to come. So now we've got to ask ourselves some questions. What would cause a company which had been trading profitably for 150 years to suddenly embark on a new career of conquest and political rule? And how were the British able to carve out this new state for themselves, rising to the top of the contending powers of late Mughal India? Neither Clive nor the company had a big plan here. In many ways, all of these actions were the product of circumstance, if not fully accidental. Circumstances really lined up to create opportunities, and the British took advantage of them. There were several factors at work here. The War of Austrian Succession and then the 7 Years' War had brought both competitive instinct to India and also active European competition. This didn't last long because Duplessis returned to France and French power in India began to decline, but it stirred up a lot of new and unexpected patriotic sentiments among European powers. Increasingly, the Bengal trade had become more important, and there was a sense that it really needed to be fully taken advantage of. But there was also just sheer greed at work. When Robert Clive left India in 1772, he declared in the House of Commons that he was astonished at his own moderation, having left India with what was then an immense fortune, including the rights to collect in an Indian district that was worth £28,000 every year. The company was The company was initially hesitant of all these new costs of administering a province so far away from Britain. But once it became clear how much money they were going to make and how much of the Asian trade they could actually hope to control, they were willing to play a new role. The company constructed a new palatial headquarters for itself in London, and as its centerpiece, they used the huge painting of the East offering its riches to Britain. As they moved into Bengal, the company took advantage of a dynamic that we talked about last time, that military fiscalism, and that became the key to success in the political system of late Mughal India. This meant that the British always had to pay lip service to the ultimate authority of the Mughal emperor in Delhi, even if it didn't functionally mean anything. There's a different set of questions here about why it was that the English East India Company did so well in India, while other actors, both European and Indian, didn't. For that answer, we have to go back to Europe. England was, of course, an island nation, and so trading overseas was essential to its growth. As we saw, Britain became increasingly committed to securing Indian interests at any cost. But Britain also had a strong navy, and their control of the seas gave it an edge over its other rivals. In the 17th century in Britain, it had been agrarian commerce and trade that had become the most important. But in the 18th century, it was overseas naval commerce that took over that role. The Industrial Revolution hadn't quite gotten underway by the time the British East India Company was started. But the economy had already been transformed. There was a strong sense of the value of trade and commerce. People were beginning to consume in households in a new way. And in India, Britain saw merchants who they could work with. Part of the success was just historical luck. After 1757, the East India Company had taken control of India's richest province, and so it was able to take control of local resources that gave it competitive advantage in India. It had a bigger revenue base, and with that revenue base, it could field a bigger army and ultimately organize a more efficient state structure. So while it was military fiscalism that let the British state in India take root, over time Britain was able to use a snowballing strength to subdue European and Indian powers one after the other. So let's leave it here, with the British in firm control over Bengal and looking eventually towards the consolidation of power all over the Indian subcontinent. We'll pick up next week and discuss what happens when British officials settle down and try to figure out how they're actually going to run a state. Thanks so much for joining me today. See you all next time.